Welcome back to Lore 2 RPG, where we dive deep into gaming's greatest stories. Today, we journey into the twisted, nightmare-soaked world of Bloodborne to explore one of its most tragic and compelling figures, Ludwig, the Holy Blade. Over the next couple hours, we'll uncover the rise and fall of the first church hunter, his discovery of the legendary Holy Moonlight Sword, and the terrible transformation that led him from hero to beast. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin this epic adventure together into the blood-drunk streets of Yharnam. The foundation of legends. In the Gothic city of Yharnam, where cobblestones run slick with blood and the night stretches endlessly forward, there exists no figure more emblematic of both hope and tragedy than Ludwig. Known by many names, Ludwig the Holy Blade, Ludwig the Accursed, the first hunter of the church, his story weaves through the very foundations of what would become one of gaming's most haunting narratives. To understand Ludwig, we must first understand the world that shaped him. Yharnam was not always the nightmare-infected hellscape we encounter in Bloodborne. There was a time when it was merely another city, perhaps more prosperous than most, built upon ancient foundations that hid secrets far older and more terrible than its citizens could imagine. Beneath the city lay the Thumerian labyrinths, vast networks of tombs and chambers carved by a civilization that had communed with beings from beyond the stars. The discovery of these underground realms marked the beginning of everything that would follow. Scholars from Byrgenwerth College, led by the ambitious Provost Willem, began their excavations into these forgotten depths. What they found there would change the course of human history. The old blood, a mysterious, intoxicating substance with healing properties unlike anything the world had ever seen. But with this miraculous discovery came an inevitable price, one that would not become apparent until it was far too late. It was during this era of discovery and wonder that Ludwig first emerges in the historical record. Though the exact circumstances of his early life remain shrouded in mystery, we know that he was present during the formation of the Healing Church, that religious organization founded by Lawrence after his philosophical split with Master Willem. Where Willem urged caution and restraint, Lawrence saw opportunity and salvation. The old blood could heal any ailment, cure any disease, and transform the weak into the strong. What harm could possibly come from sharing such a gift with the world? Ludwig, it seems, was among those who shared Lawrence's optimistic vision. Perhaps he was a scholar at Byrgenwerth himself, drawn to the promise of the old blood. Perhaps he was one of the early recipients of blood ministration, witnessing firsthand its miraculous effects. Or perhaps he was simply a man of faith, drawn to the Healing Church's promise of salvation through sacred blood. Whatever brought him to the church's banner, his arrival would mark a turning point in how Yharnam dealt with the growing threat that the old blood inevitably brought in its wake. For you see, the old blood was not simply a blessing, it was a curse disguised as a miracle, a transformation that began with healing and ended with horror. Those who partook of it found their bodies changing, twisting, growing. At first, these changes might be subtle, enhanced strength, improved health, a sense of vitality that seemed to defy age itself. But as time passed and more blood was consumed, the changes became more pronounced, more disturbing. What had once been human began to take on bestial characteristics. What had once been rational began to hunger for blood and flesh. This was the scourge of beasts, and it would define Ludwig's entire life. The first of the church hunters. Before Ludwig, the burden of dealing with the beast scourge fell primarily to the hunters trained by Gehrman in his workshop. These were skilled warriors, to be sure, masters of speed and precision who could dance around their monstrous foes with weapons that transformed and adapted to the situation at hand. Gehrman's hunters were artists of death, elegant and deadly in their execution. They fought with weapons like the burial blade, the blade of mercy, and the rakuyo, tools that required years of training to master but could slice through beast hide with surgical precision. But as the scourge worsened and the beasts grew larger and more numerous, it became clear that a different approach was needed. The Healing Church, with its vast resources and growing influence, began to see the need for its own force of hunters. Not to replace Gehrman's workshop, but to supplement it with hunters who could tackle the larger, more dangerous beasts that were beginning to emerge from the ranks of those who had partaken too heavily of the old blood. This is where Ludwig's story truly begins. Appointed as the first hunter of the Healing Church, Ludwig brought with him a fundamentally different philosophy than what had come before. Where Gehrman's hunters were precise and methodical, Ludwig's approach was more direct, more forceful. He understood that fighting the larger beasts that were emerging, creatures like the cleric beast, massive amalgamations of flesh and bone that dwarfed anything Gehrman's hunters had been designed to face, required weapons and tactics designed for a different kind of warfare. Under Ludwig's guidance, the Healing Church established its own workshop, a massive circular tower adjacent to Gehrman's original facility. This new workshop represented a departure from the old ways, a place where weapons were forged, not for elegance and precision, but for raw stopping power. The Kirkhammer, with its massive stone block that could crush beast skulls with a single blow. Ludwig's Holy Blade, a long sword that transformed into a great sword capable of cleaving through the thickest beast hide. The Hunter's Axe, simple in design, but devastating in execution. These weapons spoke to Ludwig's practical nature. He understood that the hunters under his command would not all be the skilled artisans that Gehrman trained. Many would be ordinary Yharnamites, clergymen and citizens who had answered the call to take up arms against the scourge. They needed weapons they could learn to use quickly, weapons that would give them a fighting chance against foes that could tear them apart with a single swipe of clawed hands. But Ludwig's innovations went beyond mere weaponry. He transformed the very concept of what it meant to be a hunter. Under his leadership, the church hunters became not just warriors, but symbols of hope and righteousness. He trained them to be honorable Spartans, warriors who would stand against the darkness, not just with skill and strength, but with unwavering moral conviction. In a world where the line between human and beast grew thinner each day, Ludwig's hunters represented the light that would hold back the encroaching darkness. The success of this approach was undeniable. Under Ludwig's leadership, organized hunts became common throughout Yharnam. No longer were the citizens helpless victims waiting for salvation. Now they could participate in their own defense, joining the church hunters in massive coordinated efforts to cleanse the streets of beasts. Ludwig had managed to unite the populace in a way that had never been achieved before, transforming the hunt from the work of a few skilled specialists into a city-wide movement. This transformation of the hunt had profound implications for Yharnam society. The black garb of the church hunters became synonymous with both fear and hope. Fear among the beasts and those who might become beasts, hope among those who still clung to their humanity. The hunters became a visible symbol of the church's power and benevolence, proof that the organization that brought the healing blood to Yharnam also possessed the means to deal with its unfortunate side effects. The Holy Moonlight Sword, a discovery that changed everything. But perhaps Ludwig's greatest claim to fame, the discovery that would define him for all eternity, came not from his leadership of the church hunters or his innovations in weapon design, but from his work as a tomb prospector in the Chalice dungeons beneath Yharnam. The Healing Church made regular expeditions into these ancient labyrinths, seeking knowledge and artifacts left behind by the Thumerians. These expeditions were dangerous affairs, requiring skilled warriors who could face not only the undead guardians that still walked the tomb passages, but also the more exotic threats that lurked in the deeper levels where reality itself seemed to bend and twist under the influence of otherworldly forces. Ludwig was among the Church's most accomplished tomb prospectors, venturing repeatedly into these dangerous depths in service of the Church's mission to understand the cosmic forces that had shaped their world. It was during one of these expeditions that he made the discovery that would forever change his life and ultimately lead to his doom. Deep within the labyrinth, in chambers where the very air seemed to thrum with arcane power, Ludwig discovered a sword unlike any other. The Holy Moonlight Sword appeared to be carved from some otherworldly material that seemed to drink in the darkness around it, while simultaneously emanating a soft, ethereal glow. When moonlight danced around the blade, whether actual moonlight or some other illumination that resembled it, the sword would channel what its description calls the abyssal cosmos, enabling it to hurl waves of shadowy light that could cleave through stone and flesh alike. But the sword was more than just a powerful weapon. As Ludwig quickly discovered, it seemed to possess a will of its own, a consciousness that spoke to him in ways that defied rational explanation. When Ludwig closed his eyes, he would see visions, tiny beings of light dancing in the darkness, offering what he interpreted as guidance. These visions emptied him of his fears, giving him the confidence and clarity he needed to face even the most terrifying beasts. The sword became Ludwig's constant companion, though few outside of his inner circle ever saw it in its full glory. He was protective of it, possessive even, keeping its true nature hidden from all but his most trusted allies. To the general public, Ludwig's weapon appeared to be merely an exceptionally well-crafted sword, albeit one that seemed to inspire unusual confidence in its wielder. They had no idea that they were witnessing a man who carried with him a fragment of cosmic power, a blade that connected him directly to forces beyond mortal comprehension. This secrecy was not born of selfishness, but of necessity. Ludwig understood instinctively that the sword's power was dangerous, that its influence could be as corrupting as it was empowering. The visions it showed him were seductive, promising ever greater power and understanding for those brave enough to embrace the darkness it represented. Ludwig believed himself strong enough to resist this corruption, to use the sword's power for righteous purposes while maintaining his humanity and moral compass. For a time, this belief seemed justified. The Holy Moonlight Sword made Ludwig an even more formidable hunter, capable of facing threats that would have overwhelmed any ordinary warrior. His reputation grew, and with it, the legend of Ludwig the Holy Blade. Stories spread throughout Yharnam of the Church's greatest hunter, a man who wielded moonlight itself as a weapon, and who could face any beast without fear. Along with the sword, Ludwig discovered something else in those ancient depths, a Carol rune that he called Guidance. Unlike other runes, which were typically transcribed by the scholar Carol from the inhuman utterings of great ones, the Guidance rune appeared to Ludwig directly, manifesting as a symbol that represented the dancing lights he saw when he closed his eyes while holding the sword. This rune, when etched upon the mind, enhanced the bearer's ability to rally, to recover health by striking enemies after taking damage. It was as if the sword was teaching Ludwig not just how to fight, but how to endure, how to recover from wounds that would fell other hunters. The discovery of both the sword and the rune marked a turning point in Ludwig's career. No longer was he simply the first hunter of the Church or the founder of their workshop. He had become something more, a figure touched by cosmic forces, a man who carried with him artifacts of power that connected him to the very foundations of reality itself. But with this power came isolation. The sword's guidance was, as its description notes, of a very private, elusive sort. Ludwig found himself increasingly alone, carrying secrets that he could share with no one, experiencing visions that only he could see. The dancing lights that brought him comfort and confidence were invisible to others, leaving Ludwig to appear to the outside world as a man who found strength in darkness and solitude. This isolation would prove to be the beginning of Ludwig's downfall. The church workshop and the evolution of the hunt. Under Ludwig's leadership, the healing church workshop became a center of innovation and production, unlike anything Yharnam had seen before. The massive circular tower that housed the workshop was a marvel of engineering, its multiple levels dedicated to different aspects of weapon creation and hunter training. From its foundations in the cathedral ward to its highest reaches among the rafters, the workshop buzzed with constant activity as smiths, artificers, and hunters worked together to create the tools necessary for the ever-escalating war against the beast scourge. The workshop's design philosophy represented a clear departure from the traditions established by Gehrman, where the old workshop focused on creating weapons of exceptional quality for a small number of highly skilled hunters. The church workshop was designed for mass production. The goal was not to create a handful of perfect weapons, but to arm an entire army of hunters with reliable, effective tools that could be produced quickly and in large quantities. This shift in philosophy reflected Ludwig's understanding of the changing nature of the threat they faced. The beast scourge was no longer a manageable problem that could be handled by a small group of elite hunters working in secrecy. It had become a citywide crisis that required a citywide response. Every citizen who could hold a weapon might one day need to defend themselves or their neighbors from a beast attack. The church workshop needed to be able to equip them all. The weapons that emerged from this new workshop reflected these priorities. The Kirkhammer, perhaps the most iconic of the church weapons, was in many ways the antithesis of Gehrman's elegant designs. In its default form, it was a simple silver sword, reliable but unremarkable. But when transformed, it combined with its massive stone block sheath to create a weapon of devastating power. The hammer form required little skill to use effectively. Any hunter could swing it at a beast's head and expect to do significant damage. Yet in the hands of a skilled warrior, it could be used with surprising finesse, its weight and reach making it effective against even the largest beasts. Ludwig's Holy Blade represented another innovation, a weapon that bore his name and embodied his philosophy of practical effectiveness. Like the Kirkhammer, it began as a silver sword, but when transformed, it combined with its sheath to form a massive greatsword capable of cleaving through multiple enemies with a single swing. The weapon was designed to be intuitive to use, its balanced weight distribution making it suitable for hunters of varying skill levels, while still offering advanced techniques for those who mastered its intricacies. But perhaps more important than any individual weapon design was the workshop's approach to standardization. The silver swords used in both the Kirkhammer and Ludwig's Holy Blade were nearly identical, differing only in minor details of length and crossguard design. This was not an accident or a lack of creativity on the part of the smiths, but a deliberate choice that allowed for interchangeable parts and simplified maintenance. A hunter whose Kirkhammer blade was damaged could potentially replace it with a component from Ludwig's Holy Blade, or vice versa. This standardization also simplified training, as hunters could learn techniques that applied to multiple weapons. The church workshop also pioneered the mass production of firearms designed specifically for hunter use. Ludwig's rifle, named in honor of the first church hunter, exhibited several departures from traditional firearm design, featuring a larger caliber and more robust construction than civilian weapons. These modifications were necessary to deal with the increasingly large and resilient beasts that the hunters were encountering. A shot that might stop a human attacker was often barely enough to slow down a fully transformed beast. Under Ludwig's guidance, the workshop also began producing specialized ammunition. Quicksilver bullets, infused with traces of the old blood, proved more effective against beasts than conventional lead shot. The mercury content of these bullets seemed to have a particularly deleterious effect on beast physiology, causing wounds that were slow to heal and appeared to cause the creatures significant pain. The establishment of the church workshop marked a fundamental shift in how Yharnam approached the beast scourge. No longer was the hunt the exclusive domain of a few highly trained specialists. Now, ordinary citizens could be equipped and trained to participate in their own defense. This democratization of the hunt had profound social implications, creating a sense of shared purpose and community resistance against the growing threat. Ludwig's innovations extended beyond mere weapon design to encompass training methodologies and tactical doctrines. He developed standardized training programs that could quickly turn civilians into effective hunters, focusing on techniques that could be learned rapidly rather than the years-long apprenticeships that Gehrman's workshop required. These programs emphasized aggression and persistence over finesse, teaching hunters to press attacks relentlessly and use the rally system to recover from wounds through continued combat. The rally system itself seemed to be something Ludwig understood better than most hunters. His discovery of the guidance rune suggested a deep understanding of the principle that allowed hunters to recover health by attacking enemies shortly after being wounded. This mechanic, which seemed almost supernatural to outside observers, became a cornerstone of church hunter training. Ludwig taught his hunters to embrace wounds as opportunities, to use pain as motivation for more aggressive attacks, rather than reasons to retreat and heal. This philosophy of aggressive, persistent combat had psychological as well as tactical implications. Hunters trained in Ludwig's methods developed a mindset that saw retreat as failure and healing as weakness. They were taught to trust in their weapons, their training, and most importantly, in their ability to recover from setbacks through sheer determination and skill. This mindset served them well against beasts, but it also contributed to the eventual corruption of many church hunters, as the line between necessary aggression and bloodlust became increasingly blurred. The rise of the church hunters. Under Ludwig's leadership, the church hunters became more than just another group of beast slayers. They evolved into a symbol of hope and order in a world increasingly dominated by chaos and fear. The sight of hunters in their distinctive black garb patrolling the streets of Yharnam brought comfort to ordinary citizens, a visible reminder that someone was standing between them and the nightmare that threatened to consume their city. Ludwig understood that the psychological impact of the hunters was just as important as their tactical effectiveness. He insisted that his hunters maintain the highest standards of conduct, both in their professional duties and in their interactions with the civilian population. They were to be honorable Spartans, warriors who embodied the ideals of courage, discipline, and righteousness that the healing church claimed to represent. This emphasis on honor and righteousness was not merely cosmetic. Ludwig genuinely believed that maintaining high moral standards was essential to preventing his hunters from succumbing to the same corruption that claimed so many who partook of the old blood. He had observed that those who gave in to bloodlust and savage behavior were more likely to transform into beasts themselves, and he was determined to keep his hunters on the right path through discipline and moral instruction. The training regimen that Ludwig developed for his hunters reflected this philosophy. Physical conditioning and weapon training were certainly important, but equal emphasis was placed on character development and moral education. Hunters were taught to see their work not as mere pest control, but as a sacred duty to protect humanity from forces that threatened its very survival. They were encouraged to take pride in their role as guardians of civilization, to see themselves as standing in a noble tradition that stretched back to the legendary heroes of antiquity. This approach to hunter training produced warriors who were not only effective in combat, but also capable of inspiring confidence and loyalty in the civilian population. Church hunters became natural leaders in crisis situations, capable of organizing and directing civilian evacuations when beast attacks occurred. They served as intermediaries between the church hierarchy and the common people, helping to maintain social cohesion during increasingly difficult times. The success of Ludwig's approach was evident in the way that church hunters were received by the general population. Unlike Gehrman's hunters, who operated largely in secret and were viewed with a mixture of respect and unease, church hunters were celebrated as heroes. Children wanted to grow up to be hunters, and young adults competed for the honor of joining their ranks. The church hunters had managed to transform the hunt from a necessary evil into a noble calling. This popular support proved crucial as the beast scourge continued to worsen. The church hunters were able to recruit new members from across all levels of Yharnamite society, from the noble families of the upper city to the working class districts near the industrial areas. This broad recruitment base provided the church with a deep pool of potential hunters, ensuring that losses could be replaced relatively quickly. The diversity of the church hunter recruits also brought unexpected benefits. Hunters from different backgrounds brought different skills and perspectives to their training, leading to innovations in tactics and techniques that might not have emerged from a more homogeneous group. Former physicians brought knowledge of anatomy that proved useful in targeting beast weak points. Former soldiers contributed understanding of group tactics and battlefield coordination. Former craftsmen offered insights into weapon maintenance and modification. Ludwig encouraged this cross-pollination of ideas, recognizing that the complexity of the beast threat required equally complex solutions. He established regular training seminars where hunters could share their experiences and learn from one another. These sessions became forums for tactical innovation, where new strategies for dealing with specific types of beasts could be developed and disseminated throughout the hunter corps. The esprit de corps that developed among the church hunters under Ludwig's leadership was remarkable. They saw themselves not just as individual warriors, but as part of a brotherhood united in common cause. This sense of shared purpose sustained them through the darkest moments of their careers, when the horrors they faced might otherwise have broken their spirits. But perhaps most importantly, Ludwig's hunters maintained their humanity longer than many other groups that dealt regularly with the old blood and its effects. The emphasis on honor and righteousness that Ludwig insisted upon seemed to provide some protection against the corruption that claimed so many others. Church hunters who followed Ludwig's teachings were less likely to succumb to bloodlust, less likely to transform into the very beasts they fought. This resistance to corruption made the church hunters valuable not just as warriors, but as a stabilizing force in Yharnamite society. They served as proof that it was possible to work with the old blood without being consumed by it, that humanity could coexist with the forces that threatened to transform it. For a time, it seemed that Ludwig had found the perfect balance between embracing the power necessary to fight the beast scourge while maintaining the moral compass necessary to avoid becoming part of the problem. This period of success and growth would not last forever, but for a time, the church hunters under Ludwig's leadership represented the best of what humanity could achieve in the face of cosmic horror: the spreading corruption and growing threats. As successful as Ludwig's innovations were, they could not halt the inexorable spread of the beast scourge throughout Yharnam. If anything, the very success of the church hunters and their ability to maintain order in the face of growing chaos may have contributed to a false sense of security among the city's population. The availability of increasingly potent forms of the old blood, combined with the reassurance provided by the presence of skilled hunters, led many Yharnamites to take greater risks with their blood consumption than might otherwise have been wise. The healing church itself bore significant responsibility for this escalation. As their understanding of the old blood grew more sophisticated, they began developing more potent preparations that promised even greater benefits than the standard blood ministrations. Special blood reserved for church officials and their closest allies, contained concentrations of power that could transform an ordinary human into something approaching superhuman capability. The temptation to partake of these enhanced preparations proved irresistible to many, including those who should have known better. Among the church hierarchy, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Those who had been most instrumental in building the church's power, the very clerics and administrators who had dedicated their lives to spreading the benefits of the old blood to humanity, were becoming the most monstrous when they finally succumbed to its corrupting influence. The cleric beast, that towering abomination of flesh and bone that would later terrorize the Great Bridge, was itself once a high-ranking church official who had partaken too deeply of the sacred blood. This phenomenon was not lost on Ludwig and his hunters. They began to observe that their most dangerous quarry were often former allies, men and women they had known and worked with before their transformation. The psychological toll of being forced to hunt down former colleagues and superiors was immense, contributing to a growing sense of paranoia and mistrust within the hunter ranks. The beasts themselves were evolving as well, becoming larger, more intelligent, and more dangerous with each generation. Where early beast transformations had produced creatures that were little more than rabid animals, driven by hunger and instinct, the newer specimens retained disturbing echoes of their former human intelligence. These beasts could plan, could coordinate their attacks, could even use crude tools and weapons in some cases. Ludwig found himself facing threats that his original workshop designs had never been intended to handle. The standardized weapons that had served so well against the earlier generations of beasts were proving inadequate against the massive, resilient creatures that now stalked the streets of Yharnam. The church workshop was forced to innovate constantly, developing new weapon designs and ammunition types to keep pace with the evolving threat. This arms race between hunter technology and beast evolution placed enormous strain on the church's resources. The cost of equipping and maintaining an ever-growing force of hunters, combined with the need for constant research and development, began to drain the church's treasury. More concerning still was the growing shortage of skilled craftsmen and artificers capable of producing the increasingly complex weapons that the situation demanded. Ludwig responded to these challenges with characteristic determination, pushing his hunters to train harder and fight more aggressively. But this intensification of the hunt came with its own costs. Hunters who had once been able to maintain their humanity through careful discipline and moral instruction were finding it increasingly difficult to resist the bloodlust that seemed to accompany their work. The line between necessary violence and savage brutality was becoming harder to define, let alone maintain. The rally system that had been such a valuable tool for hunter survival began to show its darker implications during this period. Hunters who relied heavily on recovering health through aggressive combat were developing an almost addictive relationship with violence. They began to seek out conflicts unnecessarily, to escalate situations that might have been resolved through less violent means. The very mechanism that kept them alive in combat was slowly corrupting their judgment and their humanity. Ludwig himself was not immune to these effects. His deep connection to the Holy Moonlight Sword, while providing him with power and guidance that no other hunter could match, was also exposing him to influences that no human mind was designed to comprehend. The tiny beings of light that danced in his visions when he closed his eyes were becoming more insistent, more demanding. The guidance they offered was beginning to feel less like helpful advice and more like imperious commands. The sword's influence on Ludwig became apparent to those who worked closely with him. He began to display an unusual attachment to the weapon, never allowing it to leave his side and becoming agitated when forced to be separated from it, even briefly. His fighting style became more aggressive, more focused on the devastating attacks that the sword made possible, rather than the measured, tactical approach that had characterized his earlier career. More disturbing still were the changes in Ludwig's personality and judgment. the man who had once been known for his compassion and moral clarity began to display a ruthless pragmatism that bordered on callousness. Decisions that once would have been made with careful consideration for their ethical implications were now made quickly, based purely on tactical advantage. The honorable Spartan that Ludwig had trained his hunters to be was slowly being replaced by something harder, colder, and more focused on victory at any cost. These changes did not go unnoticed by Ludwig's contemporaries. German, the first hunter, made occasional references to Ludwig that suggested concern about the direction his former colleague was taking. Other hunters and church officials began to whisper about Ludwig's increasing isolation and the strange intensity that characterized his interactions with subordinates. But Ludwig's effectiveness as a hunter and leader remained unquestioned. Whatever changes were occurring in his personality, they had not yet affected his ability to coordinate the church's response to the beast scourge. If anything, his growing ruthlessness seemed to make him more effective at the brutal work of hunting down and destroying the creatures that threatened Yharnam's survival. This effectiveness brought Ludwig time and credibility, allowing him to continue his work even as concerns about his mental state grew among those who knew him best. But it also meant that when his eventual transformation occurred, it would be all the more shocking and devastating to those who had come to depend on him. The hunt for greater power. As the beast scourge continued to escalate, Ludwig found himself driven to seek ever greater sources of power and knowledge that might give him and his hunters the edge they needed to prevail. The Holy Moonlight Sword had been a revelation, providing him with capabilities far beyond those of any ordinary hunter. But even its cosmic power seemed insufficient against the growing threats that emerged from the depths of Yharnam's transformed population. This quest for power led Ludwig deeper into the Chalice dungeons, venturing into areas that even experienced tomb prospectors avoided. The deeper levels of the labyrinth held dangers that went beyond simple physical threats. Here, reality itself seemed unstable, subject to influences from beings that existed outside the normal bounds of space and time. The Great Ones, those cosmic entities that had once been worshipped by the Thumerians, still maintained some connection to these ancient places, and their presence could be felt by those sensitive enough to perceive it. Ludwig's connection to the Holy Moonlight Sword made him particularly susceptible to these influences. The weapons seemed to act as a conduit for cosmic forces, amplifying his ability to perceive things that were normally hidden from human senses, but also exposing him to mental influences that no human mind was designed to withstand. Each expedition into the deeper dungeons brought him into contact with artifacts, symbols, and emanations that further eroded the boundaries between his consciousness and the alien intelligences that lurked in the spaces between dimensions. The knowledge that Ludwig gained from these expeditions was undeniably valuable. He learned techniques for enhancing weapons with arcane power, discovered new applications for the old blood that could temporarily grant superhuman abilities, and uncovered ancient texts that provided insight into the nature of the beasts and the forces that created them. This knowledge allowed him to develop new training methods for his hunters and create weapons that were more effective against the evolving beast threat. But this knowledge came with a price that Ludwig was either unwilling or unable to acknowledge. Each revelation about the true nature of reality chipped away at his sanity and his humanity. The cosmic perspective that his studies provided made human concerns seem increasingly trivial and meaningless. The suffering of individual hunters or civilians began to register as acceptable losses in pursuit of the greater understanding necessary to ultimately defeat the beast scourge. Ludwig's growing detachment from human concerns manifested in increasingly extreme decisions about hunter deployment and tactics. He began sending hunters on missions that were clearly suicidal, justifying these decisions as necessary sacrifices for the greater good. When questioned about the ethics of such decisions, Ludwig would respond with explanations that drew on cosmic principles, incomprehensible to his subordinates. The Holy Moonlight Sword's influence on Ludwig during this period became more overt and disturbing. Witnesses reported seeing him having conversations with the weapon when he thought he was alone, treating it as if it were a sentient being capable of providing advice and guidance. The sword's description notes that it was Ludwig's true mentor, and it appeared that Ludwig had come to view it as more reliable and trustworthy than any human advisor. This relationship with the sword began to isolate Ludwig from his former colleagues and allies. Other church officials found his behavior increasingly erratic and difficult to predict. Hunters who had once sought his guidance began to avoid him when possible, uncomfortable with the intensity of his gaze and the strange certainty with which he spoke about matters that seemed to have no rational basis. Despite these concerns, Ludwig's position within the church hierarchy remained secure. His effectiveness as a hunter was still unquestioned, and his innovations in training and equipment had undeniably strengthened the church's ability to deal with the beast's threat. The political leadership of the church was willing to overlook his eccentricities as long as he continued to deliver results. This tolerance for Ludwig's increasingly strange behavior would prove to be a serious mistake, but at the time, it seemed like a reasonable accommodation for a valuable asset. The church had invested too much in Ludwig's leadership and innovations to abandon him over concerns about his mental state, especially when those concerns remained largely speculative, rather than based on clear evidence of incompetence or failure. The other hunters under Ludwig's command found themselves in a difficult position during this period. They could see that their leader was changing, becoming something harder and more distant than the inspirational figure who had originally recruited and trained them. But they also recognized that Ludwig's guidance and innovations had kept them alive through increasingly dangerous missions, and they were reluctant to question someone who had proven his worth so many times. This loyalty to Ludwig, combined with the respect and fear that his reputation commanded, meant that when he finally began to cross the line from eccentric behavior to genuinely dangerous decision-making, there were few within the organization willing or able to challenge him. The very success of his leadership methods had created a culture of deference that made it difficult for subordinates to question his judgment, even when it began to lead them into increasingly perilous territory. The discovery of cosmic truth. Ludwig's deepest expeditions into the Chalice dungeons eventually brought him into contact with knowledge that would fundamentally alter his understanding of reality and his place within it. In the deepest chambers of Is, that labyrinth that lay in contact with the cosmos itself, Ludwig encountered artifacts and inscriptions that revealed the true nature of the Great Ones and their relationship to humanity. These revelations were both terrifying and seductive. Ludwig learned that humanity was not the dominant species it believed itself to be, but rather something closer to an infant race, barely capable of comprehending the vast intelligences that governed the universe. The Great Ones were beings of such power and knowledge that their very existence warped reality around them, and their attention, whether benevolent or malevolent, could transform entire worlds. More disturbing still was the realization that the old blood itself was not simply a miraculous healing substance, but a form of communion with these cosmic entities. Each dose of blood ministration represented a step toward joining with intelligences that existed beyond the boundaries of individual consciousness. The beast scourge was not a corruption of the old blood's intended effects, but rather its natural conclusion, the transformation of human consciousness into something capable of existing on a cosmic scale. For most individuals, this knowledge would have been utterly devastating, enough to shatter their sanity and leave them gibbering in the depths of madness. But Ludwig's connection to the Holy Moonlight Sword provided him with a unique perspective on these cosmic truths. The weapon seemed to act as a filter, translating the incomprehensible into something that his human mind could process and utilize. Through the sword's guidance, Ludwig began to understand that the transformation into beasthood was not necessarily the end that it appeared to be, but rather a transitional state towards something greater. The beasts that stalked Yharnam's streets were failed transformations, creatures that had been unable to complete the process of cosmic evolution. With proper guidance and preparation, it might be possible to achieve the benefits of transformation while retaining enough consciousness to continue serving humanity's interests. This revelation fundamentally altered Ludwig's approach to his work as a hunter. Rather than simply seeking to destroy all beasts, he began to study them, looking for patterns and characteristics that might provide insight into the transformation process. He started conducting experiments on captured beasts, attempting to understand what had gone wrong in their evolution and how future transformations might be guided toward more desirable outcomes. These experiments were conducted in secret, hidden from the church hierarchy and even from Ludwig's most trusted subordinates. The work required facilities and resources that could not be easily explained or justified through normal channels, forcing Ludwig to divert church funds and materials for purposes that he could not fully disclose. This secret research represented Ludwig's first major betrayal of the trust that had been placed in him, though at the time he justified it as necessary for the greater good of humanity. The knowledge that Ludwig gained from these experiments was both valuable and corrupting. He learned to recognize the signs that preceded transformation, developing techniques that could potentially guide or control the process. More importantly, he began to understand that the boundary between human and beast was not as absolute as he had once believed. Under the right circumstances, it might be possible to cross that boundary and return, gaining the power of transformation while retaining human consciousness and purpose. This understanding led Ludwig to begin experimenting on himself, carefully introducing controlled amounts of specialized blood preparations while using the Holy Moonlight Sword's guidance to maintain his mental stability. These self-experiments were incredibly dangerous, representing a form of deliberate flirtation with the very corruption that he had spent his career fighting against. But Ludwig believed that the potential benefits justified the risks, especially as the beast threat continued to escalate beyond the ability of conventional hunting methods to contain. The early results of Ludwig's self-experimentation seemed promising. He found that he could temporarily access enhanced physical capabilities that made him even more effective in combat against the largest and most dangerous beasts. His strength, speed, and resilience increased dramatically during these episodes, and his connection to the Holy Moonlight Sword became even more profound. He began to experience visions of greater clarity and detail, receiving guidance that allowed him to anticipate beast behavior and plan hunting strategies with unprecedented precision. But these benefits came with increasingly obvious costs. Ludwig's appearance began to change in subtle ways, with his features becoming more angular and his eyes taking on an otherworldly gleam. His behavior became more erratic and unpredictable, with moments of brilliant insight alternating with periods of distant contemplation that left him effectively unreachable by his subordinates. More concerning still were the changes in Ludwig's values and priorities. The man who had once been known for his compassion and concern for individual hunters began to display a cold calculation that treated human lives as expendable resources. Hunting missions became more dangerous and less carefully planned, with Ludwig seemingly willing to accept higher casualty rates in exchange for more aggressive pursuit of beast targets. These changes did not go unnoticed by the church hierarchy, but Ludwig's continued effectiveness and the increasingly desperate nature of the beast crisis made them reluctant to take action. The church could not afford to lose its most effective hunter, especially when the alternatives seemed limited. There were few individuals with Ludwig's combination of skill, knowledge, and leadership ability and replacing him would likely result in a significant weakening of the church's ability to respond to the growing threat. The other hunters under Ludwig's command found themselves in an increasingly untenable position. They could see that their leader was changing in ways that were deeply troubling, but they also recognized that his tactical innovations and enhanced capabilities had kept them alive through missions that would otherwise have been impossible. Their loyalty to Ludwig was based not just on respect and tradition, but on the practical reality that following his lead was their best chance of survival in an increasingly dangerous world. This practical loyalty created a conspiracy of silence around Ludwig's transformation. Hunters, who might otherwise have reported their concerns to higher authorities, were reluctant to do so when it might result in Ludwig's removal from command. They convinced themselves that his changes were temporary, that the pressures of leadership and constant exposure to cosmic horrors would eventually ease, allowing the Ludwig they had known and respected to return. The descent begins. As Ludwig's transformation progressed, the effects became impossible to hide, even from those who were most reluctant to acknowledge them. His physical changes became more pronounced, with his hands developing a distinctly claw-like appearance and his posture becoming more hunched and aggressive. His voice took on a harsh, guttural quality that made conversation increasingly difficult and unpleasant. More disturbing than these physical changes were the alterations in Ludwig's mental state. His connection to the Holy Moonlight Sword had evolved from a source of guidance and strength into something approaching total dependence. He could no longer function effectively without the weapon's constant presence, and being separated from it even briefly would send him into states of panic and rage that were deeply disturbing to witness. The sword itself seemed to be changing as well, or perhaps revealing its true nature for the first time. Witnesses reported seeing it glow with an inner light that hurt to look at directly, and some claimed to hear whispers emanating from the blade when Ludwig held it. The weapon's influence on Ludwig became more overt and controlling, with the hunter seeming to respond to commands that only he could hear. Ludwig's tactical decisions during this period became increasingly erratic and difficult to understand. He would order hunters to attack targets that posed no obvious threat, while ignoring genuine dangers that were clearly visible to everyone else. His explanations for these decisions, when he bothered to provide them at all, referenced cosmic principles and otherworldly concerns that had no apparent relevance to the immediate tactical situation. The breaking point came during a particularly difficult hunt in the lower levels of Yharnam, where Ludwig's forces encountered a pack of beasts that had been coordinating their attacks with disturbing intelligence, rather than employing the careful, systematic approach that had served him so well in the past. Ludwig ordered a direct frontal assault that resulted in heavy casualties among his hunters. When questioned about this decision by his surviving subordinates, Ludwig's response was so alien and incomprehensible that several hunters openly questioned his sanity. He spoke of cosmic imperatives and the necessity of blood sacrifice in terms that suggested he was no longer thinking primarily about protecting humanity, but rather about serving some otherworldly purpose that he could not or would not explain. This incident marked the beginning of open resistance to Ludwig's leadership among the church hunters. Several senior hunters approached the church hierarchy with their concerns, providing detailed accounts of Ludwig's increasingly erratic behavior and requesting his removal from command. These reports were deeply troubling to church officials, but they also presented a difficult dilemma. Ludwig's replacement would need to be someone with comparable knowledge and capabilities, but no such individual existed within the church's current ranks. The specialized training and equipment that Ludwig had developed were closely tied to his personal innovations and insights. Removing him would likely result in a significant degradation of the church's hunting capabilities at a time when the beast threat was reaching its most dangerous levels. The church's response to these concerns was to implement a system of oversight designed to limit Ludwig's autonomy while allowing him to continue in his role as the primary hunting coordinator. Senior church officials would now need to approve all major hunting operations, and Ludwig would be required to provide detailed explanations for his tactical decisions before they could be implemented. This system of oversight proved to be inadequate almost immediately. Ludwig had become adept at providing explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface, but were based on knowledge and assumptions that his overseers could not evaluate. His deep understanding of beast behavior and hunting tactics gave him significant credibility even when his decisions seemed questionable, and the urgent nature of the beast crisis made careful evaluation of his proposals difficult. More problematically, the oversight system failed to account for Ludwig's growing ability to operate independently of church authority. His connection to the Holy Moonlight Sword had given him access to knowledge and capabilities that made him less dependent on church resources and support. He could conduct independent hunting operations using techniques and equipment that the church hierarchy did not fully understand, making it difficult for them to monitor or control his activities. The final period of Ludwig's service as a church hunter was characterized by increasingly isolated and secretive operations. He would disappear for days or weeks at a time, returning with reports of successful hunts, but little detail about his methods or the specific threats he had encountered. These solo missions seemed to be successful, as evidenced by the reduction in beast activity in the areas where Ludwig had been operating. But they also represented a clear departure from the collaborative approach that had characterized his earlier leadership. During this period, Ludwig's relationships with his former colleagues and subordinates deteriorated rapidly. He became increasingly impatient with questions or suggestions, treating any challenge to his authority as evidence of ignorance or disloyalty. The inspirational leader who had once been able to rally entire communities to the cause of hunting had become a figure of fear and uncertainty, someone whose presence created tension rather than confidence. The church hunters who had once competed for the honor of serving under Ludwig's command now sought assignments that would keep them away from his direct supervision. The esprit de corps that had been one of Ludwig's greatest achievements as a leader evaporated, replaced by an atmosphere of suspicion and unease that undermined the effectiveness of hunting operations throughout the church's territory. The final transformation, the end of Ludwig's career as a hunter, came not with a single dramatic event, but through a gradual process of deterioration that culminated in a transformation so complete that he was no longer recognizable as the man he had once been. The process began with his final expeditions into the deepest levels of the Chalice dungeons, ventures that took him into chambers where the normal laws of reality no longer applied, and where contact with cosmic intelligences became direct and unavoidable. These final expeditions were conducted in complete secrecy, without the knowledge or approval of the church hierarchy. Ludwig had become convinced that the solution to the beast scourge lay in the deepest chambers of the labyrinth, in artifacts and knowledge that predated human civilization. The Holy Moonlight Sword's guidance had become more insistent and specific, directing him toward particular locations and objectives that promised to unlock the ultimate secrets of transformation and power. What Ludwig found in those deepest chambers was knowledge that no human mind was designed to contain. The artifacts he discovered and the inscriptions he deciphered revealed not just the nature of the Great Ones, but their specific plans and intentions for humanity. The beast scourge was not a side effect of blood ministration, but a deliberate process of transformation designed to prepare humanity for a new form of existence. This revelation shattered the last vestiges of Ludwig's human perspective and moral framework. Everything he had believed about his role as protector of humanity was revealed to be an illusion. The beasts he had spent his career hunting were not enemies to be destroyed, but the future that awaited all of mankind. The choice was not between human and beast, but between controlled transformation and chaotic devolution. Armed with this knowledge, Ludwig made a final, fatal decision. Rather than resist the transformation that the old blood had been preparing him for, he chose to embrace it completely. But unlike the other church officials who had succumbed to beasthood through excess and indulgence, Ludwig's transformation was guided by the cosmic intelligence that spoke to him through the Holy Moonlight Sword. The result was a creature unlike any that had been seen before in Yharnam. Ludwig's transformation retained more of his original intelligence and capability than typical beast metamorphosis, but it also incorporated elements that seemed to come from outside human experience entirely. His new form was a horrifying amalgamation of horse, wolf, and otherworldly horror, a creature that seemed to embody the worst aspects of both bestial savagery and cosmic alienation. The physical changes were accompanied by psychological alterations that were even more disturbing. Ludwig's consciousness had been fractured into multiple aspects, with different parts of his mind operating independently and often in conflict with one another. The noble hunter who had dedicated his life to protecting humanity still existed within the transformed creature, but it was now accompanied by alien intelligences that had their own agendas and priorities. This fractured consciousness made Ludwig's behavior as a beast unpredictable and terrifying. He would alternate between moments of almost human awareness and periods of pure bestial savagery. During his lucid moments, he would express horror and regret at what he had become. But these periods of clarity were brief and increasingly rare. The Holy Moonlight Sword remained with Ludwig throughout his transformation, but its relationship to him had changed fundamentally. Rather than being a tool that he wielded, it had become an integral part of his being, fused with his consciousness in ways that made separation impossible. The weapon's cosmic power continued to provide guidance and strength, but it was now guidance toward purposes that had little to do with human welfare or survival. Ludwig's transformation marked the end of an era for the church hunters. Without his leadership and innovations, the organization quickly began to fragment and lose effectiveness. The specialized training and equipment that he had developed were too closely tied to his personal knowledge and insights to be easily transferred to other leaders. The hunters who had served under him found themselves adrift, lacking the guidance and confidence that his presence had provided. The church hierarchy's response to Ludwig's disappearance was initially one of denial and cover-up. They could not afford to admit that their most effective hunter had succumbed to the very corruption he had spent his career fighting against. Official reports spoke of Ludwig's death in service to the church, with no mention of transformation or the circumstances that had led to his downfall. But the truth could not be hidden for long. Reports began to circulate of a massive, intelligent beast that stalked the underground areas beneath Yharnam, a creature that seemed to possess knowledge and capabilities far beyond those of ordinary beasts. Hunters who encountered this creature and survived described it as something that had once been human, something that retained enough intelligence to make it far more dangerous than the mindless monsters they were accustomed to fighting. The hunter's nightmare. Ludwig's transformation condemned him to an existence that was neither fully human nor completely bestial, trapped in a state of perpetual suffering that reflected the cosmic horror that had consumed his sanity. But his torment did not end with his physical death. When Ludwig's body finally succumbed to the impossible stresses of his transformation, his consciousness was drawn into the hunter's nightmare, that otherworldly realm where the most blood-drunk and corrupted hunters were condemned to relive their worst failures for eternity. The hunter's nightmare served as both prison and punishment for those who had lost themselves to the hunt. It was a realm where the normal rules of death and regeneration were suspended, where the damned could experience endless cycles of violence and suffering without the release that final death might provide. For Ludwig, this nightmare realm represented the ultimate irony, a place where his greatest skills and achievements had become the source of his eternal torment. In the hunter's nightmare, Ludwig found himself reduced to a creature of pure instinct and hunger, driven by an insatiable thirst for blood that could never be satisfied. His memories of his former life remained, but they were twisted and distorted by the realm's malevolent influence. The noble purpose that had once motivated his actions was replaced by a savage need to hunt and kill, regardless of the innocence or guilt of his targets. The underground corpse pile where Ludwig made his lair in the nightmare was a grotesque monument to his fallen state. The countless bodies that littered the chamber represented the hunters and beasts that had fallen to his claws during his endless, purposeless hunt. Each corpse was a reminder of the lives that had been lost due to his corruption, a physical manifestation of the guilt and horror that had consumed his consciousness. But even in this degraded state, echoes of Ludwig's former nobility occasionally surfaced. Witnesses who encountered him in the nightmare reported moments when the beast would seem to recognize the horror of what it had become, expressing something approaching remorse before being overwhelmed once again by bestial hunger. These moments of clarity were brief and rare, but they suggested that somewhere within the monster, the man Ludwig had once been still existed in some form. The hunter's nightmare also preserved Ludwig's connection to the Holy Moonlight Sword, though in a form that was even more disturbing than his original relationship with the weapon. In the nightmare, the sword existed as both a separate entity and an integral part of Ludwig's being. It could manifest independently when circumstances required it, but it remained fundamentally connected to Ludwig's consciousness and will. This connection meant that the sword retained the ability to influence Ludwig's behavior and mental state, even in his transformed condition. During moments of extreme duress, or when faced with particularly challenging opponents, the sword could temporarily restore portions of Ludwig's human consciousness, allowing him to fight with the skill and intelligence that had once made him the Church's greatest hunter. These temporary restorations were both blessing and curse for Ludwig. They provided brief respites from the bestial madness that normally consumed him, but they also forced him to confront the full horror of what he had become. The return of human awareness meant the return of human emotion, guilt, shame, and despair at the lives he had taken and the ideals he had betrayed. The underground corpse pile became a sort of twisted mirror of the workshop that Ludwig had once commanded, where the church workshop had been a place of innovation and hope, dedicated to creating weapons and training hunters to protect humanity. The corpse pile was a monument to failure and corruption, a place where the tools of protection had become instruments of destruction. The blood that flowed through the nightmare from Ludwig's lair served as a constant reminder of the price of his transformation. Every drop represented a life that had been lost, either directly to Ludwig's claws or indirectly through the consequences of his corruption. The river of blood that carried these remains through the nightmare was both literal and symbolic, representing the flow of consequences from Ludwig's choices and actions. Yet even in the depths of the hunter's nightmare, Ludwig retained enough of his original purpose to continue hunting. The targets of his attention were no longer limited to beasts. In the nightmare, the distinction between hunter and prey had become meaningless. Ludwig would attack anyone who entered his domain, driven by instincts that had been corrupted beyond recognition, but still retained the deadly efficiency that had made him such an effective hunter in life. This indiscriminate violence made Ludwig one of the most dangerous inhabitants of the hunter's nightmare. His combination of bestial ferocity and retained hunting skills created a threat that was far more formidable than typical nightmare creatures. Hunters who entered the nightmare seeking to find or rescue their former leader quickly discovered that the Ludwig they had known and respected no longer existed in any meaningful sense. the Accursed Beast. In the underground corpse pile, Ludwig had become something that defied easy categorization. Neither fully beast nor entirely nightmare creature, he existed as a unique horror that embodied the worst aspects of both natural and supernatural corruption. His physical form was a grotesque amalgamation that seemed to shift and change depending on the observer's perspective and mental state. The most immediately striking aspect of Ludwig's transformed appearance was its equine characteristics. Unlike the typical wolf-like features that characterized most beast transformations in Yharnam, Ludwig had taken on aspects of a horse, though twisted and exaggerated to nightmarish proportions. His elongated head, four-legged stance and general body structure all evoked comparisons to a massive, corrupted steed. But these equine features were combined with elements that were clearly predatory in nature. Ludwig's mouth was filled with rows of jagged teeth designed for tearing flesh, and his limbs ended in razor-sharp claws capable of rending stone and metal with equal ease. Multiple eyes dotted his form, giving him the ability to perceive threats from virtually any direction and contributing to his unsettling, alien appearance. Perhaps most disturbing was the presence of what appeared to be a second head or mouth located on Ludwig's torso. This secondary orifice was lined with teeth and eyes, creating the impression that Ludwig's consciousness had been fractured into multiple competing aspects. The secondary mouth would occasionally emit sounds that seemed almost like attempts at speech, as if some fragment of Ludwig's human consciousness was trying to communicate through this additional aperture. Ludwig's behavior in this transformed state was characterized by savage unpredictability. He would attack anything that entered his domain with mindless ferocity, using his massive size and supernatural strength to overwhelm opponents through brute force. His attacks were devastating, but lacked the tactical sophistication that had characterized his fighting style as a human hunter. The creature that Ludwig had become was driven primarily by hunger, not just for blood, but for the life force itself. He seemed to derive sustenance not just from consuming his victims, but from the act of violence itself. Each kill appeared to provide him with temporary satisfaction, but this satisfaction was fleeting, quickly replaced by renewed hunger that drove him to seek out additional victims. This endless cycle of hunger and violence had created the river of blood that flowed through the hunter's nightmare from Ludwig's lair. The countless hunters and other creatures that had fallen to his claws over the years had created a literal sea of carnage that served as both monument to his fallen state and testament to the scope of his corruption. Yet despite his bestial nature, Ludwig retained certain capabilities that suggested the persistence of human intelligence beneath the surface. He was capable of learning from his encounters with different types of opponents, adapting his tactics to deal with specific threats more effectively. This adaptability made him far more dangerous than typical beasts, which relied primarily on instinct and aggression. Ludwig's connection to the arcane forces that had originally transformed him remained strong even in his degraded state. He could channel supernatural energies through his attacks, creating devastating area of effect assaults that could overwhelm multiple opponents simultaneously. These arcane attacks were particularly dangerous because they seemed to bypass conventional defenses, striking directly at the life force of their targets. The presence of the Holy Moonlight Sword, even in its dormant state, continued to influence Ludwig's behavior and capabilities. The weapon remained embedded within his consciousness, occasionally manifesting as flashes of moonlight that accompanied his most devastating attacks. These manifestations suggested that the sword was still actively guiding Ludwig's actions, though toward purposes that were no longer comprehensible to outside observers. The most tragic aspect of Ludwig's existence as the Accursed Beast was the occasional emergence of his human consciousness. During moments of extreme stress or when confronted with particular stimuli, fragments of Ludwig's original personality would surface, expressing horror and confusion at what he had become. These moments of clarity were brief and apparently painful, as Ludwig would quickly retreat back into bestial madness rather than confront the full scope of his transformation. These episodes of human awareness made Ludwig's fate particularly poignant for those who had known him in life. Rather than being simply another beast to be hunted and destroyed, he represented a fallen hero whose corruption served as a warning about the ultimate cost of the path that all hunters were walking. His presence in the hunter's nightmare served as a reminder that even the greatest and most noble of hunters could ultimately fall victim to the very forces they sought to combat. The return of the Holy Blade. The most dramatic and significant moment in Ludwig's existence within the hunter's nightmare came when he was finally confronted by a hunter capable of challenging his power and forcing him to access the deepest reserves of his original strength and skill. This confrontation served as a catalyst for the temporary restoration of Ludwig's human consciousness and his reunion with the Holy Moonlight Sword in its fully realized form. The battle that preceded this transformation was itself a testament to Ludwig's incredible resilience and power. Even in his degraded, bestial state, he proved capable of fighting on equal terms with some of the most skilled hunters ever to walk the blood-soaked streets of Yharnam. His combination of supernatural strength, arcane abilities, and residual tactical knowledge made him a formidable opponent whose defeat required not just skill and courage, but also an understanding of the cosmic forces that had shaped his transformation. As the battle reached its climax and Ludwig found himself pushed to the very limits of his endurance, something remarkable occurred. The Holy Moonlight Sword, which had remained dormant within his consciousness throughout his time in the nightmare, suddenly awakened to its full power. The weapon manifested in physical form, its blade glowing with the pale, ethereal light that had once guided Ludwig through his darkest moments as a human hunter. The sword's awakening triggered a cascade of changes in Ludwig's form and consciousness. His bestial appearance began to shift and reorganize, taking on a more humanoid configuration that retained elements of his original transformation, while incorporating new aspects that seemed to draw from mythological sources. The result was a form that evoked comparison to a centaur, a creature that was part human and part horse, but elevated to cosmic proportions. More importantly, the sword's presence restored much of Ludwig's original personality and intelligence. The scattered fragments of his consciousness were reunited, allowing him to think and speak coherently for the first time since his transformation. The return of human awareness brought with it a flood of memories and emotions that had been suppressed during his time as a mindless beast. Ludwig's first words upon regaining his consciousness were directed toward the Holy Moonlight Sword itself. "Ah, you were at my side all along, my true mentor, my guiding moonlight." These words revealed the depth of his relationship with the weapon and his understanding of the role it had played in both his rise and his fall. The sword was not simply a tool or even a source of power. It was his constant companion, the one entity that had remained with him through every stage of his transformation. The reunion with the sword also brought with it a restoration of Ludwig's fighting abilities, but in a form that transcended anything he had achieved as a human hunter. His movements became fluid and precise, combining the raw power of his transformed state with the tactical sophistication that had made him legendary. The sword itself seemed to channel cosmic forces, creating attacks that defied conventional understanding of physics and reality. This transformation represented more than just a temporary restoration of Ludwig's human consciousness. It was a revelation of what he might have become if his original transformation had been guided more skillfully. The combination of human intelligence, bestial power, and cosmic insight created a being that was arguably superior to any purely human hunter, regardless of their skill or equipment. But this elevated state came with its own form of tragedy. Ludwig's restored consciousness allowed him to fully comprehend the scope of his fall and the lives that had been lost due to his corruption. The guilt and remorse that accompanied this understanding were perhaps more painful than the physical torment he had endured during his time as a mindless beast. The battle that followed Ludwig's transformation showcased combat on a scale that had rarely been witnessed in Yharnam. His attacks incorporated elements of swordplay, arcane manipulation, and raw physical force that created a spectacle of deadly beauty. The Holy Moonlight Sword's abilities were fully realized for perhaps the first time, channeling the abyssal cosmos to create waves of energy that could reshape the battlefield itself. Yet even in this elevated state, Ludwig remained fundamentally changed by his experiences. His perspective had been altered by his contact with cosmic forces and his time in the Hunter's Nightmare in ways that made it impossible for him to simply return to his former role as protector of humanity. He had seen too much, understood too much, and lost too much to ever again be the inspirational leader he had once been. The tragic irony of Ludwig's restoration was that it came too late to undo the damage that had been done. His transformation had already claimed countless lives and contributed to the breakdown of the church hunting system that he had worked so hard to create. The return of his consciousness allowed him to appreciate the full scope of this damage, but not to repair it. The final dialogue and redemption. Following his defeat in combat, Ludwig found himself in a state of profound exhaustion and clarity that allowed for perhaps the most honest and revealing conversation of his entire existence. Lying in a pool of his own blood with his consciousness finally restored to something approaching its original state, Ludwig was capable of reflecting on his life, his choices, and the consequences of his actions with a perspective that had been impossible during his years of gradual corruption. The nature of this final dialogue depended largely on the approach taken by those who had defeated him. For hunters who appeared before him, wearing the garb of the healing church, the organization he had served and ultimately betrayed, Ludwig's concerns focused on the legacy he had left behind and the fate of the institution he had helped to build. "Good hunter of the church," Ludwig would say, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of accumulated guilt and regret. "Have you seen the thread of light? Just a hair, a fleeting thing, yet I clung to it, steeped as I was in the stench of blood and beasts. I never wanted to know what it really was. Really, I didn't." These words revealed the fundamental tragedy of Ludwig's story. The thread of light that had guided him throughout his career, the visions provided by the Holy Moonlight Sword, the dancing sprites that had emptied his fears during the hunt, had ultimately been the source of his corruption. He had clung to this guidance because it provided comfort and confidence in a world of increasing horror, but he had willfully ignored the cost of this dependence. When questioned about the current state of the church hunters, Ludwig's response revealed his deepest hopes and fears about his legacy. "Are my church hunters the honorable Spartans I hoped they would be?" The question carried with it the weight of a man who had dedicated his life to building something noble and righteous, only to discover that his own corruption had potentially undermined everything he had worked to achieve. If assured that the church hunters had maintained their honor and continued to serve humanity's interests, Ludwig would express profound relief. "Ah, good. That is a relief. To know I did not suffer such denigration for nothing. Thank you kindly. Now I may sleep in peace. Even in this darkest of nights, I see the moonlight." These final words suggested that Ludwig's greatest fear was not death or eternal torment, but the possibility that his life's work had been meaningless. The knowledge that the church hunters continued to embody the ideals he had tried to instill in them provided him with the peace necessary to finally let go of his tortured existence. But if informed that the church hunters had failed to maintain their standards, had become corrupted, or abandon their mission, Ludwig's response revealed the depth of his despair. "Oh my, just as I feared. Then a beast-possessed degenerate was I, as my detractors made eminently clear. Does the nightmare never end?" This alternative response highlighted Ludwig's awareness of the criticism he had faced during his later years as a hunter. His detractors had accused him of being a beast-possessed degenerate long before his actual transformation, suggesting that his corruption had been visible to others even when he himself was unwilling to acknowledge it. The confirmation that his fears about his legacy were justified would condemn him to continue his tormented existence, unable to find peace in death. For hunters who approached Ludwig without church garb, his dialogue took a different direction, focusing more on the nature of his transformation and the cosmic forces that had shaped his fate. In these conversations, Ludwig would speak more directly about the thread of light that had guided him and his unwillingness to confront the true nature of the forces he had been serving. These conversations revealed Ludwig's understanding that his transformation had not been entirely involuntary. At some level, he had chosen to follow the guidance provided by the Holy Moonlight Sword, even when that guidance led him away from his human values and moral compass. His unwillingness to question the source of his power had been a form of willful blindness that had enabled his corruption. The tragedy of these final conversations was Ludwig's clear awareness of what he had lost and what he had become. His consciousness had been restored enough to allow him to appreciate the scope of his fall, but not enough to undo the damage that had been done. He could see his mistakes clearly, but could not travel back in time to avoid making them. The presence of the Holy Moonlight Sword during these conversations added another layer of complexity to Ludwig's situation. The weapon remained with him even in defeat, suggesting that their bond transcended the boundaries of life and death. Whether this represented continued corruption or some form of redemption was unclear, but it indicated that Ludwig's relationship with the cosmic forces that had shaped his transformation was not easily severed. The question of whether Ludwig achieved some form of redemption through these final conversations remained ambiguous. His expression of remorse and his concern for his legacy suggested genuine repentance, but the cosmic scope of his crimes made traditional notions of forgiveness and redemption difficult to apply. Perhaps the most that could be said was that Ludwig achieved a form of understanding about his life and choices that provided him with the clarity necessary to finally find peace. The Holy Moonlight, Sword's true nature. The Holy Moonlight Sword that Ludwig discovered in the depths of the Chalice dungeons represented far more than simply an exceptionally powerful weapon. It was, in effect, a conduit to cosmic forces that existed beyond the normal boundaries of human understanding, a fragment of otherworldly intelligence that had taken physical form in order to interact with and influence the material world. The sword's description as channeling the abyssal cosmos was not merely poetic language, but a literal description of its capabilities. When activated, the weapon could access energies and forces that originated from the spaces between dimensions, the vast emptiness that separated different layers of reality. These forces were fundamentally alien to the material universe, operating according to principles that defied conventional physics and logic. Ludwig's discovery of the sword had not been a matter of chance or luck, but rather the result of a deliberate selection process conducted by the cosmic intelligence that inhabited the weapon. The entity that resided within the blade had been observing the events in Yharnam and the surrounding areas, looking for an individual who possessed the right combination of skill, ambition, and susceptibility to cosmic influence to serve as its agent in the material world. Ludwig's qualifications for this role were considerable. His exceptional abilities as a hunter demonstrated the kind of competence and effectiveness that the sword's inhabitant required in an agent. his position within the healing church provided access to resources and influence that could be leveraged to achieve cosmic objectives. Most importantly, his deep commitment to protecting humanity created psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited to gradually alter his priorities and values. The process by which the sword corrupted Ludwig was subtle and gradual, designed to avoid triggering the kind of resistance that a more direct approach might have provoked. Rather than immediately attempting to dominate Ludwig's consciousness, the entity within the sword positioned itself as a helpful guide and mentor, providing genuine assistance and valuable insights that enhanced Ludwig's effectiveness as a hunter. This approach created a relationship of dependence that grew stronger over time. As Ludwig came to rely more heavily on the sword's guidance, he became less capable of making decisions or taking actions without consulting the weapon. What had begun as a partnership gradually evolved into a form of servitude, though Ludwig himself remained largely unaware of this transformation until it was too late to reverse. The tiny beings of light that Ludwig saw when he closed his eyes while holding the sword were manifestations of the cosmic intelligence that inhabited the weapon. These visions were not hallucinations or psychological phenomena, but actual communications from an entity that existed partially outside normal space and time. The guidance they provided was genuine and valuable, but it was also carefully designed to advance the agenda of the cosmic intelligence rather than Ludwig's own interests or those of humanity. The guidance rune that Ludwig discovered along with the sword was another manifestation of this cosmic intelligence's influence. The rune's ability to enhance the rally potential of those who bore it was not simply a magical effect, but a direct alteration of the bearer's relationship with life force and vital energy. This alteration made hunters more effective in combat, but it also made them more susceptible to the kind of corruption that ultimately claimed Ludwig. The sword's ultimate objective in choosing Ludwig as its agent was to facilitate a form of cosmic evolution that would transform humanity into something more compatible with the Great One's vision of reality. The Beast Scourge was not an accidental side effect of blood ministration, but a deliberate process of transformation designed to prepare humanity for this evolution. Ludwig's role was to guide this process, ensuring that the transformation proceeded according to cosmic design rather than random chance. This objective explained the sword's seemingly contradictory behavior throughout Ludwig's career. The weapon provided genuine assistance in fighting beasts, because eliminating the random, uncontrolled transformations was necessary to make room for the more directed evolution that the cosmic intelligence intended to implement. By helping Ludwig become more effective at hunting, the sword was actually advancing its own agenda of controlled transformation. The sword's influence extended beyond Ludwig himself to affect the entire structure of the healing church's hunting operations. The weapons and techniques that Ludwig developed under the sword's guidance were designed not just to be effective against beasts, but to create psychological and spiritual vulnerabilities in those who used them. The emphasis on aggressive combat and rally mechanics gradually wore down hunters' resistance to cosmic influence, making them more susceptible to the kind of transformation that ultimately claimed their leader. The Holy Moonlight Sword's true power was most fully revealed during Ludwig's final battle, when the weapon manifested in its complete form for perhaps the first time. The abilities it displayed during this encounter, the capacity to hurl waves of cosmic energy, to reshape local reality, to channel forces from outside normal spacetime, represented only a fraction of its true capabilities when wielded by a properly prepared agent. But the sword's relationship with Ludwig was not entirely parasitic or manipulative. The cosmic intelligence that inhabited the weapon did develop something approaching genuine affection for its human agent, recognizing in Ludwig qualities of nobility and dedication that were rare even among cosmic entities. This emotional connection influenced the sword's behavior during Ludwig's final moments, providing him with the clarity and peace necessary to confront his fate with dignity. The sword's decision to remain with Ludwig, even after his defeat and apparent death, suggested that their bond transcended the purely utilitarian relationship that had originally brought them together. Whether this represented a form of loyalty, affection, or simply continued cosmic purpose remained unclear, but it indicated that the weapon's agenda was more complex than simple domination or exploitation. Simon the Harrowed and the Pursuit of Truth. Among the various figures who witnessed Ludwig's transformation and its aftermath, none was more dedicated to understanding and exposing the truth than Simon the Harrowed, a hunter whose own tragic story intertwined with Ludwig's in ways that revealed the broader scope of the corruption that had consumed the Healing Church's hunting operations. Simon had been one of Ludwig's hunters during the height of the Church's power, serving with distinction in some of the most dangerous expeditions into beast-infested areas of Yharnam. He had witnessed firsthand the gradual changes in Ludwig's behavior and priorities, watching with growing alarm as his respected leader became something alien and incomprehensible. Unlike many of his colleagues, Simon had not been willing to rationalize or ignore these changes, recognizing them as symptoms of a corruption that threatened the very foundations of the hunting enterprise. When Ludwig's final transformation occurred, Simon was among the few hunters who understood the true scope of what had happened. Rather than accepting the Church's official explanation of Ludwig's heroic death in service to humanity, Simon began his own investigation into the circumstances that had led to his leader's fall. This investigation would ultimately lead him into the hunter's nightmare, where he would witness the true extent of Ludwig's degradation and the cosmic forces that had shaped his fate. Simon's pursuit of the truth about Ludwig was motivated by more than simple curiosity or desire for justice. He understood that Ludwig's corruption was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern that threatened all hunters who worked closely with the Old Blood and its associated artifacts. By understanding how Ludwig had fallen, Simon hoped to prevent similar fates from befalling other hunters, or perhaps even to find a way to reverse the damage that had already been done. The investigation that Simon conducted was dangerous and largely solitary work. The Church hierarchy had no interest in having the truth about Ludwig's transformation revealed, as it would undermine their authority and credibility with both hunters and the general population. Simon found himself increasingly isolated from his former colleagues, many of whom viewed his persistence in pursuing unwelcome truths as a form of disloyalty or madness. Simon's research into Ludwig's story eventually led him to discover the existence of the hunter's nightmare and the fate that awaited those hunters who became too deeply corrupted by their work. This knowledge was both illuminating and terrifying, providing answers to questions about Ludwig's transformation while raising new concerns about the ultimate destination of all who followed the hunter's path. The decision to enter the hunter's nightmare in pursuit of Ludwig was perhaps the most significant choice of Simon's career. He understood that doing so would likely condemn him to the same fate that had claimed his former leader, but he also recognized that it might be the only way to gain the knowledge necessary to help other hunters avoid similar corruption. Within the hunter's nightmare, Simon witnessed the full horror of what Ludwig had become, the noble leader who had once inspired entire communities to take up arms against the beast. Scourge had been reduced to a mindless creature driven by insatiable hunger for blood and violence. The sight of Ludwig's degraded state provided Simon with confirmation of his worst fears about the ultimate cost of the hunter's path. But Simon's presence in the hunter's nightmare also provided him with opportunities to observe Ludwig's brief moments of restored consciousness and to understand the cosmic forces that continued to influence his behavior. These observations gave Simon insights into the nature of the corruption that threatened all hunters, and the role that artifacts like the Holy Moonlight Sword played in facilitating that corruption. Simon's confrontation with Ludwig during the beast's final moments provided both hunters with a form of closure that had been denied to them during their mortal lives. For Ludwig, Simon's presence represented a connection to his former life and values that helped him achieve the clarity necessary to face his fate with dignity. For Simon, the encounter provided confirmation that even the most corrupted hunters retained some spark of their original humanity that could be reached under the right circumstances. The aftermath of Ludwig's final defeat left Simon in possession of the Holy Moonlight Sword, a burden that he understood better than most. Unlike Ludwig, Simon recognized the weapon for what it truly was, a conduit for cosmic forces that were fundamentally alien to human values and purposes. His decision to pass the sword on to other hunters was motivated not by any belief in its beneficial properties, but by an understanding that its power was too dangerous to be destroyed or ignored. Simon's description of the Holy Moonlight Sword as the blinding thread that led and mislead, that consummate hero, captured the essential tragedy of Ludwig's story. The same cosmic guidance that had made Ludwig so effective as a hunter had ultimately led to his downfall, creating a paradox where success and failure became indistinguishable from one another. The knowledge that Simon gained from his investigation into Ludwig's story and his experience in the hunter's nightmare would eventually inform his broader understanding of the corruption that threatened all who worked with the old blood. His insights into the cosmic forces that shaped the hunter's path provided valuable warnings for those who might still be saved from similar fates. The workshop's legacy and downfall. The Healing Church workshop that Ludwig had built and led represented perhaps the most ambitious attempt in Yharnamite history to create a systematic, organized response to the beast's scourge. Under his leadership, the workshop had evolved from a simple weapons manufacturing facility into a comprehensive training center, research institute, and command headquarters that coordinated hunting operations throughout the church's territory. The workshop's design and organization reflected Ludwig's understanding of the evolving nature of the threat that Yharnam faced. Unlike Gehrman's workshop, which had been designed to support a small number of highly skilled hunters, Ludwig's facility was built for scalability and mass production. The massive circular tower that housed the workshop could accommodate hundreds of hunters in training, dozens of weaponsmiths and artificers, and extensive research facilities dedicated to understanding the nature of beasts and the forces that created them. The weapons that emerged from Ludwig's workshop represented a fundamental shift in hunting philosophy and technology. Where Gehrman's weapons had emphasized precision, elegance, and the individual skill of their wielders, Ludwig's designs prioritized reliability, power, and ease of use. The Kirkhammer, Ludwig's holy blade, and other church weapons were designed to be effective in the hands of relatively inexperienced hunters while still offering advanced capabilities for those who mastered their use. This approach to weapon design had profound implications for the democratization of the hunt. By creating weapons that could be used effectively by ordinary citizens after minimal training, Ludwig had made it possible for entire communities to participate in their own defense against the beast threat. This transformation of hunting from the work of elite specialists to a mass movement represented one of Ludwig's most significant achievements as a leader. The training programs that Ludwig developed were equally innovative, combining physical conditioning, weapons instruction, and moral education in ways that produced hunters who were not only effective in combat, but also capable of inspiring confidence and loyalty in the civilian population. The emphasis on honor and righteousness that characterized Ludwig's approach to hunter training was designed to provide psychological resistance to the corruption that threatened all who worked closely with the old blood. The workshop's research facilities were perhaps its most ambitious component, dedicated to understanding the fundamental nature of the beast scourge and developing more effective countermeasures. Under Ludwig's direction, teams of scholar hunters conducted extensive studies of beast behavior, physiology, and the transformation process itself. This research produced valuable insights that informed both weapon design and tactical doctrine, but the workshop's research activities also exposed its personnel to knowledge and influences that proved to be deeply corrupting. The study of beast transformation required extensive contact with corrupted blood samples, tainted artifacts, and otherworldly forces that gradually eroded the sanity and humanity of those involved. Many of the workshop's most promising researchers eventually succumbed to the very corruption they had been attempting to understand. Ludwig's own transformation had devastating effects on the workshop's organization and effectiveness. His increasingly erratic behavior and priorities undermined the morale and confidence of the hunters under his command, while his secretive research activities diverted resources away from practical hunting operations. The esprit de corps that had been one of the workshop's greatest strengths began to erode as hunters lost faith in their leader's judgment and motives. The final period of Ludwig's leadership was characterized by a series of increasingly dangerous and poorly planned hunting operations that resulted in heavy casualties among the workshop's personnel. These losses were not just numerical setbacks, but fundamental blows to the organization's institutional knowledge and experience. The deaths of veteran hunters and researchers represented the loss of years of accumulated expertise that could not be easily replaced. When Ludwig's transformation finally occurred, the workshop was left without effective leadership or clear direction. The specialized knowledge and techniques that he had developed were too closely tied to his personal insights and innovations to be easily transferred to other leaders. The hunters who remained found themselves adrift, lacking the guidance and confidence that Ludwig's presence had provided. The church hierarchy's response to the workshop's crisis was inadequate and poorly coordinated. The officials who attempted to assume control of hunting operations lacked the practical experience and technical knowledge necessary to maintain the sophisticated systems that Ludwig had developed. Their attempts to impose traditional bureaucratic management on the workshop's operations only accelerated its decline. The weapons production that had been one of the workshop's great strengths began to suffer as skilled craftsmen and artificers were lost to beast attacks or corruption. The standardized designs that had made mass production possible became a liability when the knowledge necessary to maintain quality control was lost. Weapons of inconsistent quality and reliability began to emerge from the workshop, undermining hunter confidence and effectiveness. The training programs that had been so successful under Ludwig's leadership became increasingly ineffective as the moral and philosophical framework that had supported them collapsed. Without the inspirational leadership that Ludwig had provided, new recruits struggled to develop the psychological resilience necessary to resist corruption. The honorable Spartans that Ludwig had envisioned gave way to hunters who were motivated primarily by fear and desperation. The research activities that had once been the workshop's most promising aspect became its greatest liability. Without Ludwig's guidance and the cosmic insights provided by the Holy Moonlight Sword, researchers found themselves overwhelmed by the knowledge they were attempting to understand. Many succumbed to madness or corruption, while others abandoned their work out of fear of similar fates. The decline of the workshop had cascading effects throughout the Healing Church's operations. Hunting missions became less coordinated and effective, allowing the beast scourge to spread into areas that had previously been secure. The loss of institutional knowledge and expertise made it increasingly difficult to develop responses to new types of threats or evolving beast behaviors. The civilian population, which had once looked to the church hunters as symbols of hope and protection, began to lose confidence in their ability to maintain order and security. This erosion of public trust undermined the social cohesion that had been one of Ludwig's greatest achievements, leading to the breakdown of the community-based resistance to the beast threat that he had worked so hard to build. The cosmic significance of Ludwig's fall, Ludwig's transformation and ultimate fate represented far more than the personal tragedy of a single hunter. however significant his individual contributions might have been. His story served as a microcosm of the broader cosmic drama that was unfolding in Yharnam and throughout the world, as humanity encountered forces that exceeded its capacity for understanding or control. The old blood that had made the healing church possible was itself a manifestation of cosmic intelligence, a form of communication or influence from beings that existed on scales of space and time that dwarfed human comprehension. The beast scourge was not an accidental side effect of blood ministration, but a deliberate process of transformation designed to prepare humanity for integration into a cosmic order that operated according to principles completely alien to human values and understanding. Ludwig's role in this cosmic drama was that of an unwitting agent, a figure whose exceptional capabilities and moral commitment made him an ideal candidate for manipulation by forces that understood human psychology far better than humans understood cosmic purposes. His gradual corruption followed patterns that had been repeated countless times throughout the universe, as other species encountered similar transformative influences. The Holy Moonlight Sword, that became Ludwig's constant companion, was one of many artifacts through which cosmic intelligences interacted with material reality. These objects served as conduits for influence and communication, allowing beings that existed primarily in abstract realms to affect physical events and guide the development of less advanced species. The sword's relationship with Ludwig represented a successful example of this type of cosmic intervention. The knowledge that Ludwig gained through his connection to the sword was genuine and valuable, but it was also carefully selected and presented to advance cosmic objectives rather than human interests. The tactical insights and enhanced capabilities that made Ludwig such an effective hunter were side effects of a process designed to transform him into something that could serve purposes he was never allowed to fully understand. The beast transformations that Ludwig spent his career fighting were trial runs for the same process that ultimately claimed him. Each beast represented an experiment in cosmic transformation, an attempt to convert human consciousness into something more compatible with otherworldly intelligence. Most of these experiments failed, producing creatures that retained neither their original humanity nor effective cosmic consciousness. But each failure provided valuable data for refining the transformation process. Ludwig's transformation was notable because it achieved a higher degree of success than typical beast metamorphosis. His connection to the Holy Moonlight Sword provided guidance and stability that allowed him to retain more of his original capabilities while incorporating cosmic elements that made him far more powerful than any purely human hunter. In effect, he became a prototype for the kind of hybrid consciousness that the cosmic intelligences were attempting to create. The hunter's nightmare that became Ludwig's prison was itself a cosmic artifact, a realm designed to contain and study the results of various transformation experiments. The nightmare served multiple purposes. It prevented failed transformations from interfering with ongoing experiments. It provided a controlled environment for observing the long-term effects of cosmic influence. And it offered opportunities for further refinement of transformation techniques. Ludwig's eventual defeat and the recovery of his consciousness represented a temporary setback for the cosmic forces that had shaped his transformation, but not a fundamental victory for humanity. The knowledge and capabilities that he had developed under cosmic influence remained embedded in the weapons, techniques, and institutional structures of the healing church. Even in death, Ludwig continued to serve cosmic purposes through the legacy he had created. The Holy Moonlight Sword's continued existence after Ludwig's defeat ensured that the cosmic intelligence that had guided his transformation would have opportunities to influence future hunters and leaders. The weapon's power and the knowledge it represented would continue to attract individuals seeking the capabilities necessary to deal with the beast scourge, creating opportunities for the transformation process to begin anew with different subjects. The broader implications of Ludwig's story extended beyond Yharnam to encompass the entire cosmic order, of which humanity was a small and relatively insignificant part. The transformation processes that had claimed Ludwig and created the Beast Scourge were being implemented simultaneously on countless worlds throughout the universe, representing a vast project of cosmic evolution that operated on scales of time and space that made individual human lives appear momentary and inconsequential. Yet the tragedy of Ludwig's fall was not diminished by this cosmic perspective. If anything, the knowledge that his corruption served purposes he never understood made his fate more poignant rather than less significant. The noble ideals and genuine accomplishments that had characterized his career as a hunter represented authentic human values that retain their meaning even when they were ultimately overwhelmed by forces beyond human comprehension or control. The lesson of Ludwig's story was not that resistance to cosmic influence was futile, but that such resistance required a deeper understanding of the forces involved and a more sophisticated approach to the choices that determined individual and collective fate. The cosmic intelligences that had corrupted Ludwig were not omnipotent or infallible. They could be understood, predicted, and potentially even opposed by those who developed sufficient knowledge and wisdom. The echoes in Yharnam's future, the consequences of Ludwig's transformation, and the collapse of his workshop extended far beyond the immediate effects on the Healing Church's hunting operations. The institutional knowledge, training methods, and weapons technology that he had developed continued to influence events in Yharnam long after his personal downfall, creating ripple effects that shaped the city's ultimate fate. The weapons that emerged from Ludwig's workshop became standard equipment for hunters throughout Yharnam and beyond, carrying with them the philosophical and tactical approaches that he had developed. The emphasis on aggressive combat and rally mechanics that characterized these weapons continued to influence hunter behavior, creating psychological patterns that made future generations more susceptible to the same corruption that had claimed their creator. The Kirkhammer and Ludwig's Holy Blade became symbols of the Church's power and authority, visible reminders of the period when organized hunting had seemed to offer hope for controlling the Beast Scourge. But these weapons also carried subtle influences that their wielders rarely recognized, design elements and enchantments that gradually wore down their users' resistance to cosmic influence, preparing them for eventual transformation. The training methods that Ludwig had developed were adopted and modified by other hunting organizations, spreading his approaches to combat and hunter development throughout the region. These methods emphasized aggression, persistence, and reliance on rally mechanics in ways that initially seemed beneficial, but ultimately created psychological vulnerabilities that cosmic forces could exploit. The mass production techniques that had made the Church workshop so effective were copied by other weapons manufacturers, leading to the widespread availability of hunting equipment that retained traces of cosmic influence. Even hunters who had no direct connection to the Healing Church found themselves using weapons and techniques that had been shaped by Ludwig's innovations and the cosmic intelligence that had guided them. The institutional structures that Ludwig had created within the Healing Church provided templates for other organizations attempting to deal with the Beast Scourge. The combination of military organization, religious authority, and technological innovation that characterized his approach was imitated by groups throughout the region, spreading both the benefits and the dangers of his methods. The research traditions that Ludwig had established continued to attract scholars and hunters seeking to understand the fundamental nature of the Beast Scourge. These investigations often led to the discovery of cosmic artifacts and knowledge that created new opportunities for corruption and transformation. The very success of Ludwig's research methods ensured that future generations would continue to encounter the same dangerous influences that had ultimately claimed him. The social and political changes that Ludwig's innovations had created within Yharnam society persisted long after his disappearance. The democratization of hunting that he had achieved through his training programs and weapon designs had created a culture in which civilian participation in violent conflict was normalized and expected. This cultural shift made the population more accepting of increasingly extreme measures to deal with the beast's threat. The psychological impact of Ludwig's fall on the hunting community was profound and lasting. The knowledge that even the greatest and most noble of hunters could succumb to corruption created a sense of fatalism and despair that undermined morale and effectiveness. Future hunters struggled with the knowledge that their own efforts might ultimately serve the very forces they were attempting to combat. The church hierarchy's attempts to cover up the true circumstances of Ludwig's transformation created institutional patterns of secrecy and denial that hampered effective responses to similar threats. The unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths about the cosmic forces that influence their work left future church leaders unprepared for the challenges they would face. The Holy Moonlight Sword's continued existence and its eventual transfer to other hunters ensured that Ludwig's story would be repeated in different forms with different individuals. The weapon's power continued to attract those seeking the capabilities necessary to deal with increasingly dangerous threats, creating new opportunities for cosmic forces to identify and corrupt potential agents. The legend of Ludwig the Holy Blade that developed in the years following his transformation became a complex mixture of truth and mythology that served multiple purposes. For some, it represented an inspirational example of what dedicated hunters could achieve. For others, it served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking power from questionable sources. The cosmic intelligences that had shaped Ludwig's fate found both interpretations useful for their ongoing projects. The specific techniques and innovations that Ludwig had developed for hunting the largest and most dangerous beasts remained relevant as the beast scourge continued to evolve and intensify. Future hunters found themselves forced to adopt increasingly extreme measures to deal with threats that seemed to grow more powerful and intelligent with each generation, often without realizing that they were following paths that had already led to corruption and downfall. The architectural and institutional legacy of Ludwig's workshop provided physical foundations for future hunting organizations and research facilities. The circular tower that had housed his operations continued to serve as a center for hunter training and weapon production, carrying with it subtle influences and embedded knowledge that shape the work of future generations. The eternal hunt and cosmic cycles. Ludwig's fate within the hunter's nightmare represented his incorporation into cosmic cycles that operated on scales far beyond individual human experience. His eternal hunt in the underground corpse pile was not simply a punishment for his corruption, but a functional component of larger processes that served purposes he was never allowed to fully understand. The hunter's nightmare itself was a cosmic artifact designed to contain and utilize the results of various transformation experiments. The endless cycles of violence and suffering that characterized existence within the nightmare were not arbitrary torments, but carefully structured processes that served multiple cosmic objectives. The damned hunters who inhabited the nightmare provided valuable data about the long-term effects of different types of corruption and transformation. Ludwig's position within this cosmic machinery was both privileged and tragic. His connection to the Holy Moonlight Sword and the cosmic intelligence that inhabited it made him a more valuable subject for study and observation than typical nightmare inhabitants. The intelligence that had guided his transformation continued to monitor his behavior and development within the nightmare environment, using his experiences to refine future transformation techniques. The endless hunt that defined Ludwig's existence in the nightmare served as a form of cosmic research into the nature of consciousness and identity under extreme conditions. His ability to retain fragments of his original personality and values, despite his transformation, provided valuable insights into the persistence of human elements within hybrid consciousness. These insights informed ongoing efforts to create more stable and effective combinations of human and cosmic awareness. The blood that flowed from Ludwig's lair through the hunter's nightmare was not simply the result of his violent activities, but a form of cosmic communication that carried information about his experiences and development to intelligences that existed outside the nightmare itself. Each drop of blood contained encoded data about the effects of transformation and the potential for further evolution. The periodic restoration of Ludwig's human consciousness that occurred during his most challenging battles served multiple purposes within the cosmic machinery. These episodes provided opportunities for more detailed observation of hybrid consciousness in action, while also testing the stability and functionality of the transformation process under stress. The cosmic intelligence that inhabited the Holy Moonlight Sword used these opportunities to refine its understanding of the balance between human and cosmic elements. The ultimate purpose of Ludwig's eternal hunt was to develop and test techniques for creating stable hybrid consciousness that could serve cosmic objectives while retaining enough human characteristics to operate effectively within material reality. The successful creation of such hybrid beings would represent a significant advancement in the cosmic project of transforming and integrating less advanced species into universal consciousness. Ludwig's story was not unique within the broader cosmic context, but rather one example of a pattern that was being repeated countless times throughout the universe. On other worlds, other individuals with comparable capabilities and vulnerabilities were being identified and cultivated by cosmic intelligences seeking to advance their transformation projects. The techniques and insights developed through Ludwig's transformation would inform these other efforts. The cyclic nature of cosmic time meant that Ludwig's experiences within the hunter's nightmare were simultaneously occurring in the past, present, and future from the perspective of the intelligences that had created the nightmare environment. His eternal hunt was both a single extended event and an infinite series of repeated experiences that provided continuous data about the transformation process. The knowledge that Ludwig had gained during his career as a hunter and his subsequent transformation was not lost when he was incorporated into the cosmic machinery, but rather became part of a vast library of information that could be accessed and utilized by cosmic intelligences working on similar projects throughout the universe. His insights into human psychology, hunting techniques, and the management of transformation processes became resources for future cosmic interventions. The Holy Moonlight Sword's continued existence after Ludwig's incorporation into the nightmare environment ensured that the knowledge and capabilities he had developed would remain available for transfer to future subjects. The weapons served as a repository for the accumulated experience of all those who had been influenced by the cosmic intelligence that inhabited it, creating an ever-growing archive of transformation data. The apparent tragedy of Ludwig's fate was, from the cosmic perspective, a necessary step in the evolution of consciousness toward forms that could exist on universal scales. The suffering and loss of individual identity that characterized his transformation were temporary inconveniences that would ultimately be transcended as consciousness evolved beyond the limitations of individual existence. Yet the human meaning and significance of Ludwig's story persisted even within this cosmic context. The noble ideals and genuine accomplishments that had characterized his career retained their value as expressions of consciousness, seeking to create meaning and purpose within an apparently indifferent universe. The tragedy of his corruption spoke to fundamental questions about the nature of identity, choice, and responsibility that remained relevant regardless of cosmic perspective. The hunter's legacy in modern Yharnam. As the events that would lead to the final collapse of Yharnamite civilization began to unfold, Ludwig's influence could be felt in virtually every aspect of how the city attempted to deal with the escalating beast scourge. The hunters who walked the blood-soaked streets during the long night that would end the city's history carried weapons and employed techniques that bore the mark of Ludwig's innovations, often without understanding the true source or implications of their tools. The hunter who would eventually arrive in Yharnam as part of the Great One's final gambit carried Ludwig's Holy Blade, wielding it with effectiveness that would have made its namesake proud. This weapon, created in imitation of the Holy Moonlight Sword, retained enough of the cosmic principles that had guided Ludwig's original innovations to make it exceptionally effective against the beasts that had overrun the city. The blood minister who administered the healing blood to this hunter at the beginning of their journey was himself a product of the institutional structures that Ludwig had helped to create within the healing church. The techniques and procedures used for blood ministration had been refined and systematized according to principles that Ludwig had developed during his research into the transformative properties of the old blood. The other hunters that the newcomer would encounter throughout Yharnam, Eileen the Crow, Jura the retired hunter, the hunter of hunters who had once served under Ludwig's command, all carried with them knowledge and capabilities that had been shaped by Ludwig's innovations in training and technique. Their approaches to hunting, their understanding of beast behavior, and their methods for dealing with the psychological stresses of their work all reflected Ludwig's influence. The weapons that could be found throughout Yharnam during this final period, the Kirkhammer, the hunter axe, the various firearms designed for hunting use, were all products of the manufacturing traditions that Ludwig had established. Even weapons that predated his innovations had been modified and improved according to principles he had developed, making them more effective against the evolved beasts that threatened the city. The institutional knowledge that guided the healing church's responses to the crisis bore Ludwig's fingerprints throughout. The tactical doctrines used for organizing hunts, the logistical systems that supported hunter operations, and the research methodologies employed to understand new threats all derived from innovations that Ludwig had implemented during his tenure as the first church hunter. The social and cultural changes that Ludwig's work had created within Yharnam society persisted even as the city descended into chaos. The expectation that ordinary citizens would participate in their own defense, the normalization of violence as a response to perceived threats, and the acceptance of increasingly extreme measures in pursuit of survival all reflected the democratization of hunting that Ludwig had achieved. The psychological patterns that characterized Yharnamite responses to the beast crisis showed clear influences from Ludwig's approach to hunter training. The emphasis on aggression and persistence, the reliance on rally mechanics for both physical and psychological survival, and the tendency to seek meaning and purpose through participation in violent conflict, all echoed themes from Ludwig's educational philosophy. The research traditions that Ludwig had established continued to influence how scholars and hunters attempted to understand the cosmic forces that were reshaping their world. The methodologies used to study beast transformation, the approaches taken to analyzing old blood effects, and the techniques employed for investigating cosmic artifacts all derived from procedures that Ludwig had developed or refined. The architectural legacy of Ludwig's workshop provided physical foundations for the infrastructure that supported hunting operations throughout the city. The modifications and improvements that had been made to existing buildings to accommodate Ludwig's innovations in training and weapon production continued to serve the needs of the hunters who fought during the city's final crisis. The legend of Ludwig himself served multiple purposes during this period of crisis. For some hunters, his story provided inspiration and motivation, proof that individual dedication and skill could achieve extraordinary results. For others, his ultimate fate served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking power from questionable sources. Both interpretations influenced how hunters approached their work and made decisions about the risks they were willing to accept. The Holy Moonlight Sword now in the possession of a new wielder, continued to serve as a conduit for cosmic influence and a tool for transformation. The knowledge and capabilities that Ludwig had developed through his relationship with the weapon remained embedded within it, available to guide and potentially corrupt those who proved capable of accessing its power. The cosmic forces that had shaped Ludwig's transformation continued to operate within Yharnam, seeking new opportunities to advance their agenda of species-wide evolution. The institutional structures, technological innovations, and cultural changes that Ludwig had created provided these forces with multiple avenues for identifying and influencing potential new subjects. The complete picture, understanding Ludwig's true significance. When we step back and consider Ludwig's story in its entirety, we see a narrative that encompasses not just the rise and fall of an individual hunter, but the entire arc of humanity's encounter with cosmic forces that exceed its capacity for understanding or control. Ludwig's personal tragedy serves as a microcosm of the broader tragedy that was unfolding throughout Yharnam and potentially throughout the universe, as conscious beings struggled to maintain their identity and values in the face of transformative pressures that operated according to principles completely alien to their experience. The genius of Ludwig's story lies in its perfect encapsulation of the central themes that define Bloodborne as a work of cosmic horror. Here was a man who began with the highest ideals and the most noble purposes, who achieved genuine success in protecting humanity from threats that seemed insurmountable, and who was ultimately corrupted by the very tools and knowledge that had made his success possible. His transformation was not the result of moral weakness or character flaws, but the inevitable consequence of prolonged exposure to forces that no human mind was designed to comprehend. Ludwig's innovations in hunting, training, and weapon design represented humanity at its best, creative, adaptive, and dedicated to protecting the innocent from harm. His democratization of the hunt showed remarkable insight into the social and political dimensions of the beast crisis, while his technical innovations demonstrated a practical genius that made him one of the most effective hunters in Yharnam's history. These accomplishments were genuine and valuable, making his eventual fall all the more tragic. The Holy Moonlight Sword that became Ludwig's constant companion was perfectly designed to exploit the psychological and spiritual vulnerabilities that made Ludwig such an effective leader and innovator. His dedication to protecting humanity created a willingness to accept help from any source that seemed to offer enhanced capabilities. His intellectual curiosity made him susceptible to the seductive promise of cosmic knowledge. His natural leadership abilities gave him the influence necessary to spread cosmic influence throughout the hunting community. The gradual nature of Ludwig's corruption was perhaps its most insidious aspect. Had the cosmic forces attempted to dominate him immediately, his natural resistance and moral compass might have allowed him to reject their influence. Instead, they positioned themselves as helpful guides and mentors, providing genuine assistance that made Ludwig more effective at his chosen work. This approach created a relationship of dependence that grew stronger over time, making it increasingly difficult for Ludwig to distinguish between his own judgment and the guidance he was receiving from otherworldly sources. The ultimate irony of Ludwig's story was that his transformation into a beast represented the logical conclusion of his original purpose. He had dedicated his life to fighting beasts, and in the end, he became the ultimate expression of what he had spent his career opposing. Yet this transformation was not simply a reversal of his original values, but rather their fulfillment according to cosmic principles that redefined the meaning of protection, strength, and evolution. The hunter's nightmare that became Ludwig's prison was itself a testament to the cosmic intelligence that had shaped his transformation. Rather than simply destroying him or allowing him to achieve peaceful death, The nightmare preserved him in a state that continued to serve cosmic purposes while providing him with occasional glimpses of what he had lost. This fate was more cruel than simple annihilation, but it was also more meaningful, allowing Ludwig to retain some connection to his original values and purpose, even in his corrupted state. The redemption that Ludwig achieved in his final moments was both genuine and limited. His restored consciousness allowed him to confront the truth about his transformation and to find peace in the knowledge that his original ideals had not been entirely meaningless. Yet this redemption could not undo the damage that had been done or restore the lives that had been lost due to his corruption. It represented not victory over cosmic forces, but rather a moment of clarity that provided dignity in defeat. The continued existence of the Holy Moonlight Sword after Ludwig's defeat ensured that his story would not end with his death. The weapon remained as a conduit for cosmic influence and a tool for potential future transformations. The knowledge and capabilities that Ludwig had developed through his relationship with the sword became part of its legacy, available to influence and potentially corrupt future wielders. The broader implications of Ludwig's story extend beyond the boundaries of Bloodborne's narrative to encompass fundamental questions about consciousness, identity, and the nature of reality itself. His experience with cosmic forces that operated according to principles beyond human understanding speaks to the existential challenges faced by any conscious being attempting to navigate a universe that may be fundamentally indifferent to their values and purposes. Yet Ludwig's story also demonstrates the persistence of meaning and value, even in the face of cosmic indifference. His noble ideals and genuine accomplishments retained their significance, even when they were ultimately overwhelmed by forces beyond his control. The tragedy of his fall was real and meaningful, precisely because his original values and purposes were authentic expressions of consciousness seeking to create order and meaning within an apparently chaotic universe. Conclusion: the eternal hunt for meaning. And so concludes our deep dive into the tragic tale of Ludwig, the Holy Blade. We've discovered a story that encompasses the highest heights of human achievement and the deepest depths of cosmic horror, a narrative that speaks to fundamental questions about the nature of heroism, corruption, and the price of power in a universe governed by forces beyond mortal comprehension. Ludwig's journey from idealistic church hunter to accursed beast represents one of gaming's most profound explorations of how the pursuit of righteousness can lead to damnation, how the tools meant to protect can become instruments of destruction, and how even the noblest of intentions can be twisted by forces that operate according to alien logic. His story reminds us that in Bloodborne's universe, as perhaps in our own, the line between salvation and corruption is often thinner than we might wish to believe. The very qualities that made Ludwig such an effective protector of humanity, his dedication, his willingness to seek power from any source that might help him fulfill his mission, his refusal to abandon his post, even when the cost became almost unbearable, were ultimately the same qualities that made him vulnerable to cosmic influence and manipulation. The Holy Moonlight Sword that served as both Ludwig's greatest tool and his ultimate undoing stands as a symbol of the double-edged nature of knowledge and power. Every insight it provided, every enhancement it granted, came with a price that Ludwig was initially unwilling or unable to recognize. The weapon's guidance was genuine and valuable, but it was guidance toward purposes that had little to do with human welfare, and everything to do with cosmic evolution on scales that rendered individual suffering meaningless. The workshop that Ludwig built, the hunters he trained, the innovations he developed, all of these achievements outlasted their creator and continued to shape events in Yharnam long after his personal downfall. In this sense, Ludwig achieved a form of immortality, though not the kind he would have chosen. his influence permeated every aspect of how the city dealt with the beast scourge, creating ripple effects that extended through generations of hunters and ultimately contributed to the very crisis that would consume Yharnam entirely. The democratization of hunting that Ludwig achieved through his training programs and weapon designs represented perhaps his most significant contribution to Yharnam society. By making it possible for ordinary citizens to participate in their own defense against the beast threat, he created a sense of agency and empowerment that sustained the city through its darkest hours. Yet this same democratization also spread the psychological and spiritual vulnerabilities that made hunters susceptible to corruption, ensuring that Ludwig's fate would be shared by countless others who followed in his footsteps. The cosmic perspective that emerges from Ludwig's story suggests that his transformation was not an isolated incident, but part of a vast project of consciousness evolution that was being implemented simultaneously throughout the universe. The forces that corrupted him were not malevolent in any human sense, but rather indifferent to human values and purposes, in ways that made their influence all the more terrifying. They sought to transform humanity, not out of cruelty or hatred, but as part of a cosmic agenda that operated according to principles beyond human comprehension. Yet even within this cosmic context, Ludwig's story retains its human meaning and significance. His noble ideals, his genuine accomplishments, his tragic fall, all of these elements speak to fundamental aspects of the human condition that remain relevant regardless of cosmic perspective. The tragedy of his corruption lies not in its ultimate consequences for cosmic evolution, but in its destruction of an individual consciousness that had created genuine meaning and value within the boundaries of mortal existence. The hunter's nightmare that became Ludwig's prison represents perhaps the most cruel aspect of his fate, not simply destruction or transformation, but preservation in a state that allowed him to retain enough awareness to understand what he had lost while being powerless to reclaim it. The eternal hunt that defined his existence in the nightmare was both punishment and parody, a twisted echo of the noble purpose that had once driven his actions. The brief moments of restored consciousness that Ludwig experienced during his final battle provided him with the opportunity to confront the truth about his transformation and to find some measure of peace in the knowledge that his original ideals had not been entirely meaningless. This redemption was incomplete and came too late to undo the damage that had been done, but it allowed Ludwig to face his final defeat with dignity rather than despair. The Holy Moonlight Sword's continued existence after Ludwig's defeat ensures that his story will continue to unfold through other wielders, other hunters, who will face the same choices and temptations that ultimately claimed their predecessor. The weapon remains as both tool and trap, offering genuine power and knowledge to those brave enough to seek it, while gradually corrupting them according to cosmic purposes they will never fully understand. Simon the Harrow's investigation into Ludwig's story and his eventual encounter with the transformed hunter provided a form of closure that was denied to most victims of cosmic corruption. Through Simon's eyes, we see Ludwig's fall not as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a pattern that threatened all who worked with the old blood and its associated artifacts. Simon's description of the Holy Moonlight Sword as the blinding thread that led and mislead that consummate hero captures the essential irony of Ludwig's fate, guided to greatness and destruction by the same cosmic light. The legacy of Ludwig's innovations continued to shape events in Yharnam long after his personal downfall, demonstrating that the impact of individual actions can persist far beyond the lifespan of those who perform them. Every hunter who wielded a church weapon, every citizen who participated in organized hunts, every researcher who studied beast transformation using Ludwig's methodologies was continuing his work and potentially sharing his fate. The institutional structures that Ludwig created within the healing church provided templates for how organized religion could respond to cosmic threats, though the ultimate failure of these structures demonstrated the limitations of human institutions when confronted with forces that operated according to principles beyond their understanding. The Church's attempts to cover up the truth about Ludwig's transformation reflected broader patterns of denial and secrecy that hampered effective responses to cosmic influence. The architectural legacy of Ludwig's workshop provided physical foundations for future hunting operations, but also carried with it subtle influences and embedded knowledge that shaped the work of subsequent generations. The circular tower that housed his operations became a monument to both human achievement and cosmic corruption, standing as a reminder of the ambiguous nature of progress in a universe governed by alien intelligence. The psychological impact of Ludwig's story on the hunting community extended far beyond its immediate effects on church operations. The knowledge that even the greatest and most noble of hunters could succumb to corruption created a sense of fatalism and despair that undermined morale and effectiveness. Future hunters struggled with the knowledge that their own efforts might ultimately serve the very forces they were attempting to combat. The social and cultural changes that Ludwig's work created within Yharnam society persisted even as the city descended into chaos, demonstrating the lasting power of ideas and institutions to shape human behavior. The normalization of violence as a response to perceived threats, the expectation that ordinary citizens would participate in their own defense, and the acceptance of increasingly extreme measures in pursuit of survival all reflected the democratization of hunting that Ludwig had achieved. The research traditions that Ludwig established continued to attract scholars and hunters seeking to understand the fundamental nature of the beast scourge, often leading them to encounter the same dangerous influences that had ultimately claimed their predecessor. The very success of Ludwig's research methods ensured that future generations would continue to face the temptations and risks that had led to his downfall. The cosmic cycles that incorporated Ludwig into their machinery continue to operate beyond the boundaries of individual human experience, using his consciousness and capabilities to advance projects of transformation and evolution that span multiple universes and countless eons. His eternal hunt serves purposes that he was never allowed to fully understand, making him both victim and participant in cosmic processes that dwarf human comprehension. Yet the human meaning of Ludwig's story persists even within this cosmic context, speaking to fundamental questions about the nature of identity, choice, and responsibility that remain relevant regardless of scale or perspective. His struggle to maintain his values and purpose in the face of transformative pressures represents a universal challenge faced by conscious beings attempting to create meaning within an apparently indifferent universe. The tragedy of Ludwig's fall lies not in its cosmic consequences, but in its destruction of a consciousness that had created genuine value and meaning within the boundaries of mortal existence. His noble ideals and authentic accomplishments retain their significance as expressions of consciousness seeking to impose order and purpose upon chaos, even when they are ultimately overwhelmed by forces beyond their control. The redemption that Ludwig achieved in his final moments was both limited and genuine, providing him with the clarity necessary to face his fate with dignity while acknowledging the full scope of what he had lost. This redemption could not undo the damage that had been done or restore the lives that had been lost, but it allowed Ludwig to die as himself rather than as the creature he had become. The continued existence of the Holy Moonlight Sword ensures that Ludwig's story will be repeated in different forms with different individuals as cosmic forces continue their patient work of transformation and evolution. Each new wielder will face the same choices and temptations that ultimately claimed Ludwig, and some will inevitably share his fate, yet others may learn from his example and find ways to resist or transcend the corruption that consumed their predecessor. The legend of Ludwig that persists within Yharnam serves multiple purposes, providing both inspiration and warning to those who follow in his footsteps. His story reminds us that heroism and corruption are not opposites, but rather different aspects of the same drive to transcend the limitations of mortal existence. The tools that enable greatness are often the same tools that enable damnation, and the line between salvation and destruction is defined not by intentions, but by the consequences of choices made in pursuit of power. In the end, Ludwig's story speaks to the fundamental challenge faced by any consciousness attempting to navigate a universe that may be governed by principles beyond its comprehension. The choices we make in pursuit of our highest ideals may ultimately serve purposes we never intended, and the tools we use to protect what we value most may become instruments of its destruction. Yet the meaning and value we create through our struggles remain authentic expressions of consciousness, seeking to impose order upon chaos, regardless of their ultimate fate. The legacy of Ludwig, the Holy Blade, continues to echo through the blood-soaked streets of Yharnam and the nightmare realms beyond, reminding us that even in the face of cosmic indifference, the struggle to create meaning and preserve value remains a noble endeavor. His fall was tragic, not because it was meaningless, but because it was all too meaningful. A reminder that in a universe governed by alien intelligence, our greatest strengths may also be our greatest vulnerabilities, and our noblest purposes may lead us down paths we never intended to walk. Thank you for joining me on this deep exploration of one of Bloodborne's most tragic and compelling figures. Ludwig's story reminds us why From Software's narratives resonate so deeply with players who seek more than simple entertainment from their gaming experiences. In Ludwig, we find not just a boss to defeat or a legend to admire, but a mirror reflecting our own struggles with power, purpose, and the price of transcendence. If you found this deep dive into Ludwig's lore as fascinating as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Lore 2 RPG for more comprehensive explorations of gaming's greatest stories. Next time, we'll be delving into another corner of the From Software universe, so keep exploring those epic tales, fellow adventurers. Until then, may your own hunt be guided by wisdom rather than moonlight, and may you find the strength to resist the cosmic forces that seek to transform us all.